There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Here I am with another In Other Words, which is an occasional series where I talk about vocabulary, grammatical patterns, idioms, stuff like that I find in my reading. And here I have 6 new pieces of vocabulary for you from 3 different novels I've read in the last, not necessarily recently, but earlier this year. First one is The Innocence, a novel by the Newfoundland Canadian novelist Michael Crummy, an excellent novel. A little bit controversial, but I thought it was stunning. And just one phrase from that, which was a faffering wind. And it kind of reminded me of a word that I had featured in an earlier episode of, in other words, faffing about. And in fact, they are connected. Faffering, however, is a particularly Newfoundland English phrase. A faffering wind is a wind that is blowing in sudden gusts, particularly cold, chilly gusts, and a common expression. I'm not sure about modern times, but in olden times in Newfoundland has some fabulous, special vocabulary. In an earlier episode, Faff About, I believe it was from Ronan Hession's novel, Leonard and Hungry Paul. I'm pretty sure it was. I'll put a link to that episode in the show notes. Because Faff About means you're doing something in a disorganized, kind of lazy way. Not necessarily getting much accomplished. And it goes back to faff, which is where we get the faffering wind from. So faff meant dither, fuss, and flap since the 19th century, and it goes back to faffle. And this is ground I already covered in that other video, which has been in use in English since the 16th century, which meant to flap idly in the breeze. So a faffering wind goes back to faffle and faff. Faffle was to flap idly in the breeze, and then faffering, this peculiarly Newfoundland English adjective, meant to be blown about in sudden icy gusts of wind. Maybe 3 expressions from Bernardine Evaristo's Girl, Woman, Other, which co-won the Booker last year and which I really liked. There was one phrase about Carol and her teacher. I think the teacher was Mrs. King, and Carol was the student. And she is described as having blanked her teacher once she, Carol, started bunking off. So 2 words that I wasn't sure about in one sentence. Carol, who blanked her once she started bunking off. It didn't take me long to find out that a informal slang meaning in British English of blank as a verb is to deliberately ignore someone. It's kind of like give someone the cold shoulder or ghost. That word is too modern for me. When you ghost someone, you just stop talking to them. Vaguely similar. So why does blank mean that? I guess if you think about blank, a blank stare, you stare at someone blankly as if you don't know them. I think that's where it comes from. But let's dig into it a little deeper. The verb blank came into English in the middle of the 16th century, meaning to disconcert or shut someone up, to frustrate someone, and it came from the adjective blank, which, as we know, means white, pale, colorless, having empty spaces around it, void of expression. So you can see that the sense of a blank expression kind of whooped and wharfed its way into the verb meaning to shut somebody up, or in this more modern idiom, to deliberately ignore someone. It's as if when you look at them, you see a blank, hence you give them a blank look. You're not really seeing them. So blank, going farther back, meaning white, shiny white, flashing white, goes back to the Proto-Indo-European root, and I probably should explain very briefly what a Proto-Indo-European root is. It's the root that goes way back to the Proto-Indo-European language from which not only English descends, but French and German and several Indian languages and many languages around the world descend from that original Proto-Indo-European language. And When etymologists are lucky, they can trace kind of like a etymological genealogy of a word that goes back to a root in the Proto-Indo-European, and then I have such a good time discovering and sharing with you the other derivations from that root. So, the Proto-Indo-European root from which we get the word blank is, I don't know how you pronounce it, but it's spelled B-H-E-L. Here it is, which means to shine, flash, burn, or to shine white. So keep your eye on the root and then listen to all the words in English that come from that word. Black, blanch, blank, blanket, blaze, bleach, blemish, blend, blind, blonde, blue, blush, flagrant, flambe, flamboyant, flamingo, flammable. So that's blank, to blank someone, to intentionally ignore someone. What about bunk off? Peculiarly British phrase, which means to skip something, to go off, to not go to work or not go to school without permission. Go do something else. Play hooky, basically for school, is what we would say in North America, I think. But why does bunk off mean that? Bunk has many meanings, and one of the meanings of the verb means to leave. And it was often used as a noun for the same meaning. To do a bunk was to leave, to escape, to run away. Doing a bunk could mean to skip out, move out of your apartment in the middle of the night without paying rent. That leaving, escaping meaning actually goes back to bunk, meaning nonsense. I saw some speculation that this meaning of bunking off and escaping comes from the American word bunkum, which goes back to Buncombe County, North Carolina. I don't think that's true. That's a very American English word, which means nonsense. I don't think that's where it comes from, although I've seen speculation online. I think that the etymology for bunking off comes from the verb bunk, which means to occupy a bunk, as in a bunk on a ship, a bunk bed type of thing, which has that idea of a hurried departure. For example, if you're getting on a ship, if your ship's taking off, you have to bunk. That makes a little bit more sense. But ultimately, I was not able to get to the bottom of this one, so I'm looking for some help and some suggestions. That's what I found out. And somebody in the Evaristo novel is described as being a genuinely plummy man. And I didn't know what that meant, and it means highly desirable, very choice, very sought after, a plummy man. Well, it goes back to the idea of the plum, which in the 18th century was considered, I guess it still is, not necessarily by me, but as a delectable, delicious ingredient or fruit in and of its own. And starting in the 18th century, the meaning was extended and metaphorized, is that a word? To describe such things as a fortune, a rich person, and by the early 19th century, anything desirable. But the original literal meaning was full of plums. By the late 19th century, a plummy voice was a rich, mellow voice. As that plummy voice expression carried on, as often happens, it became pejorative, it became negative, and came to describe stilted, affected speech. And finally, a couple from this fabulous 1956 novel from the UK, Elizabeth Jane Howard's The Long View. I had heard the word many times, but when I encountered it in this book, I finally looked up a word that I've always wondered what the heck it meant. Why did certain street addresses or buildings, why were they called the Muse, M-E-W-S? So now I found out, and I'm happy to tell you all about it. If you didn't know, maybe I was the last person on the planet that didn't know what Muse were. Originally, Muse were coops for hawks. And that comes from the French verb muer, which meant to mold. And mews were quite common in the UK. Shakespeare used a phrasal verb, mew up, in The Taming of the Shrew, which meant to confine, coop up, or shut up. "What, will you mew her up, Signor Baptista?" is the line. In England, from the year 1377 onwards, the king's falconry birds were kept in the King's Mews at Charing Cross. By the middle of the 16th century, the royal stables were called the Muse stables. Same location, an additional function either in the same building or built on the site of the previous falconry mews, I'm not sure. There were also royal mews at St. James Palace. In London during the 17th century and then by the 18th century in America, mews described domestic stables. Washington Mews in Greenwich Village, New York City, and then after that, mews began to describe any stable buildings in any space, lane, alley, or back street onto which these buildings open. So if your front door goes onto the lane, alley, or back street, you're quite liable that the building will be called the blah blah mews. And then, in much more modern times, any residential building, similar character throughout the English-speaking world, and then the automobiles took the place of the horses and carriages. I'll put a few pictures. Here's the Charterhouse Mews in London. Here's Harbury Mews in Notting Hill. So the cage for birds is the original meaning, meant a place where hawks are put to molt. Like I say, it goes back to that old French verb muer, and that verb muer also meant to molt. It goes back to the Latin word mutare, to change. You can hear it, I'll spell it, you can see the changeability embedded in that word. And that goes back to the Proto-Indo-European root mei, M-E-I, here it is, which means to change. So molting is a type of change. And mews comes from the same Proto-Indo-European root from which we get all these words that hint at or evoke or in some way describe change. Listen to these. Amiss, common, commune, communicate, communism, commute, emigrate, excommunicate, immune, migrate, migration, mistake, municipal, mutate, mutant, mutatis mutandis, mutual, permeable, transmute, and zenith, and many more. The last one I have is a game that somebody plays. There's a brief reference. The reference is not important, but there's a reference to a game that consists of making fish bones out of a chestnut leaf, and that is an actual game that children played, and maybe still do. Please tell me in the comments. In the UK, in the 1950s, I don't know when this part of the novel was set, but the game Fishbones, according to this one source I found, I'll put a link because it's an interesting article, references it being popular in the 1950s in the UK. So here is a chestnut leaf, and you can see that it has a fairly long stem, and in Derbyshire in the 1950s, and probably many other places, you have the leaf stalk of the horse chestnut, and a stalk was held at each end by one person, and another person would place their stalk behind it at a right angle, and then each player would pull in an attempt to break the other person's stalk. That sounds so fun. Really? I don't know. It sounds interesting anyway. The winner would then be challenged with another fresh stalk, called Fishbones because it kind of looked, you can see, kind of picture it in your mind's eye. So that's what I've got for today. Thanks for watching.